Greetings, fellow Bible readers. Welcome to week 5 of our Bible read-through. This week, we finish up the book of Exodus and head on into the book of Leviticus. Now, Leviticus is a Bible book that is often challenging for modern-day Christians to read because this book of the Bible deals with a lot of the ceremonial laws that God gave to the Old Testament nation of Israel. Laws governing things like sacrifices and purification, matters of that sort. Because of the details and the topic, it can be very difficult for Christians to stay engaged in the content of that book. So I'm going to encourage you to do a lot of skimming through the book of Leviticus, because what we really want to get out of this book is we want to get the key concepts that God was driving home to the Israelites with those various laws and regulations that he gave. And so with each day, there's kind of a key word or key words that I'd like you to watch for in your reading. So let's go through the days of the week. On day 1, we finish up with the last chapter of Exodus, and we head into the first 3 chapters of Leviticus. And the key word that I really want you to watch for is the word offering. Now, granted, that word offering is going to show up a lot throughout the book of Leviticus beyond just simply day 1. However, I want you to pay special attention to it on day 1 in order to get the sense of how those offerings were required in order to be acceptable and pleasing to God to come into his presence. On day 2, as we look at chapters 4 through 6 of Leviticus, what the key word that you'll want to focus in on, or actually the 2 key words you'll want to focus in on, are sin and restitution. And those 2 key words really drive home the reality that when people mess up, when they sin, they are doing something that makes them guilty, and so they have to make restitution. They have to make a payment to cover that wrong and its guilt. Then on day 3, as we look at chapters 7 through 9 of Leviticus, the word you'll want to pay attention to is blood. I like the word offering. It's a word that shows up beyond just simply the day 3 readings. However, especially on day 3, I want you to pay attention to how blood is such an important part of being able to approach God, not only in connection with the objects that are used for worship, but especially on day 3, as we look at the ordination of Aaron and his sons as priests, we see blood being used in many ways to set them apart for that work of serving in God's temple. Then on days 4 and 5, as we look at chapters 10 through 14 of Leviticus, the key words you want to watch for are clean and unclean. These regulations about cleanliness and uncleanliness, they really were meant to drive home to the Israelites the way that sin defiles people, that it's almost like a disease, that when something is tainted by sin, it taints everything else around it. I mean, as you read through and you kind of skim through those sections dealing with the purification laws, just think about how hard it would have been to remain clean in the midst of so many ways that a person could become unclean. Then on day 6, as we head into chapters 15 through 17, the key word that you'll want to watch for is atonement, especially in chapter 16 where we get the Day of Atonement. And as you read about that Day of Atonement, I want you to think about how that pictured the work of Jesus. After all, the word atonement has to do with taking 2 people or 2 parties that are opposed to each other and setting them at one, bringing them together with each other. And in that Day of Atonement, we see a picture of what Jesus was going to do in bringing God and man together as one. And then finally on day 7, as we look at chapters 18 through 20, there isn't a particular key word that I'd like you to watch for. However, as you look at all of those various laws detailing issues in family life with sexual laws or things having to do with the community or even the land, the concept that you want to get from that reading is the interconnection between the spiritual life of those Israelites and their day-to-day life in their community. And that drives home a lesson that's very true for us still today as Christians. Our spiritual life and our daily life are not divorced from each other, but they are intimately connected with one another. That what happens in your daily life affects your spiritual life, and what happens in your spiritual life affects your daily life. And that interconnection of the religious laws with the ceremonial and civil laws for the Israelites really helps to drive that concept home. It drove it home for them and helps us to grasp it as well. That's all for this week. We'll see you next week.